Good afternoon and welcome to CEC-Gurukul lecture. In today's session, we are going to discuss the sociological theories of social change. Now, change is something which is taking place in society, in the physical environment, in the structure, in our social relationship. Everything is changing, and therefore we make to sense of how we understand social change. Now, sociological theories have been there since 18th century, trying to make sense of how society was changing from simple to complex, from primitive to civilized. In this part of the lecture, we're going to focus more or less in terms of understanding social change specifically in the context of modernity and modernization. We're going to understand thinkers who have made sense of change taking place in terms of changing the economy, politics, and the other family relations. So, social change as a term signifies change that affects the nature and structure of social groups and institutions, as well as social relationship between the individual. What comes in along with the concept of social change are two interrelated concepts. One is development and the second is progress. We often say that when there is development, change takes place, or vice versa, or change leads to progress. So we need to understand that is it always positive, that does change lead to development, does change lead to progress? Much of the theorization in sociology, especially when we look into the shift from tradition to modernity, from barbaric to civilized, are based on the assumption that it is a positive kind of change. So the change is taking place for development, it is taking place for progress. But then towards 20th century, we see a lot of scholars and thinkers are critical of this, and therefore change could be negative, it could have negative consequences, it could be harmful for the society, it could lead to certain kind of conflict, violence, and also kind of certain problems related with human society. So when we look into these concepts, development and progress, we see that the term development means formal and structural change in an organism. As society grows from simple to complex, from society develops in the sense that energy accumulates collectively. So that means that development is always kind of fruitful. It is positive. It's going to kind of bring about certain changes which are necessary for the society. Similarly, progress is a critical term. Now, progress does not mean mere development or evolution. It is not just kind of, if I say that you have progress, that there is a change or there is a development, because either of these terms, whether we say evolution or development, change is taking place. But progress is kind of more value oriented. When we say that you are progressing, there is a kind of an inherent understanding that this change is kind of better than the previous stage. So there is a certain idea of valuation, and such valuation according to certain principle. These principles could be kind of coming in from larger stake, legitimate understanding of society. It could be coming in from the way in which society has been conceptualized. So the concept of progress was most influential idea in the study of social change, especially when a lot of theorization comes in social science and sociology with the Enlightenment movement of 17th and 18th century. It was considered that Enlightenment was taking society towards development, towards progress. So you have a comparative understanding of a period prior to Enlightenment and after Enlightenment. And there was a kind of a hierarchy that those that was prior was kind of unprogressive, it was not developed, and one of the means through which development and progress was possible was technology. So there was a kind of scientific revolution, an industrial revolution where technology, industries were considered as necessary for the society to progress and develop. So if we look into the theories of sociology, much of the sociologists believed that any evolutionary development must necessarily mean that it has progressed. So, when look into the relationship between social change and development, we see social change is an objective term. It says that yes, it has changed. So, for instance, a family has undergone change from the composition. Earlier it was a large composition family to a small size, less number of family. Now what comes in through development is that does it imply that a nuclear family is more developed or more progressive than a joint family. So that is the value, or there is a kind of a value judgment attached to a particular institution. So from objective reality, which is social change, we are shifting to development, which is more subjective. Development refers to social change that will improve the lives of the person. However, as we have been familiar now, especially in the 20th and 21st century, discussions and discourses on social change, many a time development can be detrimental. And we know with the effect on environment, there is so much of negative effect, and we say the development at the cost of the nature or at the cost of environment. So we have a lot of problems related to environment in terms of climate change, global warming, and many related problems. So then we kind of come in with the concept of sustainable development, that yes, we need to develop, but that has to be sustainable. The livelihood, the nature, the environment around us do not change. But if we look into the theories till the late, say, 20th century, or most of sociologists were kind of going on with this assumption that development always kind of made change implied development and progress. Now, when we look into this concept of change, development, progress, why these big terms have become critical is to understand these terms with reference to modernity. Now, modernity, or when we kind of Reformation, Enlightenment, all these was kind of considered as values which would be kind of very progressive. So, modernity in the beginning was kind of considered as something that would transform the traditional society to more progressive society, and therefore a number of theories were articulated to understand social change in modern society, and the term which is used to these theory is referred as modernization theories, and they use a number of interrelated terms like development, progress. So for most of the 19th, 20th century sociologists, modernity was optimistic in character and based on the ideas of progress. So it was considered to be more rational, to be more organized, and the traditional society was considered as based on supernatural, so a religious belief system. It was less progressive, less developed. So a hierarchy was created between the tradition and the modernity, and they was kind of considered as evolving from one to the other. These theories often implicitly assume that capitalism, democracy, and market economy would lead to establishment of a prosperous society. Progress and development was seen as inherent characteristic of all modern industrial societies. Now, two scholars that become significant when we look into the positive side of modernity and development is to kind of look into the work of Max Weber and Talcott Parson. Now, Weber, in his terms of understanding rationality and rationalization, was describing the Occidental rationalism, in particular emphatic on this. He was kind of giving too much of stress on Occidental rationalism. Now, rationality is that every action has to have an explanation, a scientific explanation. You cannot do any action based on traditional social action or say any kind of idea of supernatural or metaphysical force. You need to have a logical, rational explanation. And this rationality was coming in from the West, and it was kind of moving society to more organized, to more rational bourgeois capitalism and socialism. But then we know that modernity had its own demerits, and there are a lot of sociological studies which we can discuss in another class in terms of talking about the negative effect of modernization. The second scholar is Talcott Parson. He was talking about value, the value system, and he was trying to talk about one particular value, which is universal achievement. So he, you again have this theory of within sociology where we were talking about change in value system or change in the status in terms of ascribed status to achievement, and ascribed status, that is status which is ascribed on the basis of birth, like your caste status, was found in traditional society, were found in simple society. As society progressed, it was shifting to achievement. So achievement becomes a universal value to be found in all modern industrial society. And this was kind of talking about relatively optimistic moment of modernity that Parson was kind to focus upon. Now, when we look into the idea of modernity and the idea of development and progress, we look into the theory of Hobhouse. He is giving us the demerits or the other side of the theory. He says that any evolution of any form does not necessarily imply that it is changing into better form, and therefore we cannot conclude that evolution necessarily implies society is progressing. According to Hobhouse, progress can be made only when the individual in society strives for ethical advancement. Social progress, therefore, is not a phenomena marked by spontaneity. It is the product of conscious effort made by social individuals. So now it is kind of relating your cultural ethics, your norms, that whether you are doing to take any kind of action for, say in terms of development or in the name of development, it has to be ethical. It implies that many a time the certain kind of industrial technological innovation needs to be thought about in keeping in mind the human life, keeping in mind the surrounding, the environment around us. If we go beyond the ethical value system, then development and progress can be detrimental. Now, when we look into the idea of social change and modernity, let us try to understand modernization theory. Now, the modernization theory implies to the theories a number of scholars who were trying to understand the change taking place in modernity, but they were following the evolutionary trend. So it was kind of an extension of the evolutionary theory, and they were stating that change is being experienced by most of the third world society by imitating or copying the values, experience and models already found in the modernized society. So this theory was basically kind of critical of the way in which there was a hierarchy created between by naming certain Western society as the first world and certain non-Western society as the third world, and articulating or putting forward the idea that what was happening in the West was perfect. It was something which was a model, and the East had to copy it. It had to kind of blindly look into it. So if there was a kind of say marriage which was kind of more in a system of contract, then the people were not going in for sacramental or religious marriage, but were favoring to go in for contract based marriages. So it was kind of changing your maybe your language, changing your way of communication, changing your dressing pattern, and there was the idea that you are negating or you are considering your own culture as inferior to the culture of the West, and therefore kind of leading to a number of problems. was adopting, assimilating and internalizing those aspects of industrial society which, if copied, would bring about improved social, economic and political development to the society. So this kind of was the idea of the modernization theory. Another relevant idea or theory which is to be understood for making sense of social change in modern times is the Chicago School. Now, the Chicago School is a neoclassical school of thought that was kind of happening in the University of Chicago in the 1915-30s. A number of scholars, they were kind of working together to give us a theory of social change and modernization. Most of the work were related to urban sociology, and it was kind of based on the symbolic interactionist approach. So this shift from evolution to functionalism to structural theory to interaction theory. And the interactionist theory, the focus is on human behavior. The focus is not on grand laws, the focus is not on institution, but in terms of how individual interact in the everyday life, and this interaction is basically symbolic. We attach meaning to the symbol, and this changes the way in which social relations are organized. So the human behavior was seen as organized by both social structure and environment, and therefore what was considered as a social structure was the outcome of both kind of genetic personal character as well as the cultural norms. According to the Chicago School, social change is inevitable, driven by industrialization, urban explosion, racial group interaction and labor specialization. Because these transformations were taking place, society had to change. It could not kind of escape. It was inevitable. The idea was to theorize these in terms of the idea given by the Chicago School was organism metaphor. Now, what is organism metaphor? Organism metaphor of society have characterized society as a whole functioning together as a single organism, or characterize society as composed of number of organisms functioning in an ecological system. So the ecological school, which kind of looks into the dialectical relation between society of environment, becomes more prominent with the understanding of society as an organism. So that the society and the environment are not unrelated. They are kind of into a mutual interdependent relation. Whatever the human being does to the environment will come back, and therefore we need to understand the development progress in terms of the dialectical relation. The Chicago School sociologist interpreted the organism metaphor as less functional and more conflict oriented. One of the scholars of Chicago School who kind of conceptualized social change was William Ogburn. In his book, Social Change with Respect to Culture and Original Nature, published in 1922, he studied the effect of technology on society. Ogburn traced direct connection between such inventions of the automobile, self-starter and kind of emancipation of women. So, there is a gender understanding of the growth of technology. And according to Ogburn, he gives the example that when women learn to drive, they enter the business world, and therefore once they enter the business world, they bring about change in the role in the household, in the family relationship, and ultimately it could lead in the kind of empowering the women. From a feminist perspective, this could be seen as a shift from what was termed as a private or the domestic domain, which was the household where women were supposed to be part of it, which in the earlier theory would be considered as the sexual division of labor. Women were doing the household domestic work, men were going out and doing the physical world. So you had this binary between the private and the public, and technology was seen as shifting women from the domestic domain to the public domain. Another concept that Ogburn gives us, and which is very significant for understanding social change, especially with reference to modernization and contemporary society, is the concept of cultural lag. Now, cultural lag as a concept helps us to understand social change. It implies maladjustment or unfit that occurs between two types of culture. One is the material culture. The material culture is technology, your kind of physical infrastructure, everything which is improving. And then the non-material culture, which is your norm, your value system, your belief, and there is a lag between the two. A lag means the material culture is developing and progressing, but the non-material culture is not able to keep pace with it. So, a gap starts happening between the material and the non-material culture. So, the focus on the idea is that cultural practices change much more slowly. Our belief system are so kind of strong that we don't give up very easily. And then the technology, because it also becomes kind of demand of the professional life, or it becomes a demand of the society, we are forced to adopt technology. But we have not changed our internal way of thinking, our value system, and therefore we are not kind of able to properly utilize that technology. What are the factors for cultural lag according to Ogburn? One is the scarcity of invention in the adaptive culture. Two, it could be mechanical obstacle to adaptive changes. The change has taken place, but you are the individual or the society has not been able to bring about or adapt that change. Then the third is heterogeneity of change. Every society, they are heterogeneous population. So some are able to adapt the culture, some of them are able to faster take on the technology or say other kind of physical changes, but other part may be deprived of it, maybe not being able to have access to that, and therefore they are kind of not able to grow their material culture. The fourth is closeness of contact with material culture. You don't have access to material culture. So, if you don't have the material culture, you will not be able to apply into your life, and a mismatch will happen. Then the fifth is connection of adaptive culture with other parts of culture. Your religious belief, your say political belief, your other ideological belief prevents you from adopting that change in a more holistic. And the last is group valuation. So we also have a lot of other theories like Robert Nisbet. He is considered as anti-evolutionism theory. For him, change is not and cannot be only an empirical change. Real or empirical change is always a change of something, somewhere and sometime, and therefore any theory of change must introduce variable of time, place and circumstances. Nisbet believed that any change is produced by events and any event is produced by change. A very important theory to understand social change is Anthony Giddens. Anthony Giddens critiqued evolutionary theory on the ground that it is kind of not only biological or organic change. His theory is known as the structuration theory, the change between the agency, individual as actor and structure. So, structuration theory says that society don't evolve as organism. There is a dialectical relation between agent and structure, and therefore it has to be understood in terms of structural principle, intersocial system, time space, epistemic characteristics and world time. So it is kind of not deterministically evolved, it is kind of determined by humans as agent. Human beings are aware of the history. They can bring about change, and therefore it is kind of more in terms of change at the structural level. So with this whole idea of trying to understand social change with reference to development, progress and modernity, we have understood the sociological theories of social change. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.